So it took you a while
It did.
until the report of the survey group, or?
Yes, I think that was when it began to be clear that, that this was not the case. But again, one of the issues that I'd never quite understood, I think it's a straightforward issue, is why, if Iraq, Saddam did not have access to these stocks, did he spend such an enormous amount of time and effort in trying to frustrate the work of the inspectors? I mean, there isn't an entirely satisfactory answer to that as far as I am aware. I mean, other than I have speculated as to whether, for example, people around Saddam knew that this production had ended and no one dared tell him, whether he wanted to keep up a pretense in order to intimidate his neighbours.
These are indeed matters for interesting speculation, but I think I'd like, because of awareness of time, to move on.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's a fair matter upon which to speculate, but I think we need to get on to questions of budgets and equipment.
Okay.
You inherited a strategic defence review that was published in 1998, and one of its main features was a focus on expeditionary warfare. Is that fair? That this was?
Yes, I think a series of white papers, and during my time we published a couple more, were moving the emphasis of the Ministry of Defence away from the kind of static territorial defence of the Cold War period to a much more flexible and, as you say, expeditionary capability. But that sounds quite straightforward to describe. It actually, as you will be better aware than I am, requires massive adjustments in capabilities. Instead of having, for example, a single and relatively relaxed logistics chain, it was necessary to have a series of such support organisations that could move very quickly at very long distance. So instead of having months, if not years, to prepare for the prospect of an attack by Warsaw Pact countries, where it was possible to see those forces building up on the other side of the border, and to have a similar amount of time to build up our own capabilities, we needed to be able to move people as we did in a weekend to Sierra Leone. So we took a decision, I think, on Friday afternoon that troops would go to Sierra Leone. They were there on Sunday morning.
But if you're talking about moving a division, say, what were the sort of planning assumptions necessary to prepare a division for a major
Well, I think
operation?
I've mentioned already, the planning assumption was roughly in the order of 6 months to be able to move a division and put it in place. We had the considerable advantage before going into Iraq of an exercise called Safe Syria, Swift Sword, that was conducted in Oman. And I visited that exercise, and I came away with, I mean, everyone rightly praises our armed forces, but I actually came away with a huge appreciation of the ability of logisticians and their ability to move this force from the United Kingdom to operate in Oman and to move it back again without any obvious other support other than that which they carried with them. There was no base there that they moved to. They moved to a desert. They set up their camp. They did their training, and they went back again. And I think it showed me in a very practical way the requirement for successful logistics, which is not something that is widely praised when people talk about the armed forces, but actually is a fundamental necessity.
Indeed. Did also perhaps this exercise demonstrate the importance of exercises?
Well, it did, because we also learned quite a number of lessons that would have been, frankly, catastrophic had we have not been aware of. We had problems with air filters on the tanks, for example, that were clogging up with sand. So I think we purchased some, I think they were known as skirts, for want of a better expression, but essentially it was to protect the air inflow. So we learned a huge number of lessons that were relevant then to the operation that was subsequently conducted in Iraq.
Now, you mentioned that the shifts envisaged in the Strategic Defence Review were really quite substantial, required quite a lot. Was the review fully funded? Sufficiently funded?
Well, I can't I mean, I can't answer that entirely from my own experience. What I can say is that when I arrived in the Ministry of Defence in October 1999, there was quite a strong feeling that it was not fully funded, and that the part of the way in which it was funded was by a commitment to a series of efficiencies in the way in which existing equipment was used in order to release cash, basically, for some of the new acquisitions. And I think everyone accepted that that was a pretty challenging target.
In fact, we were told by Kevin Tebbit that the problem was simply that the defence budget was too small. And this was the case in the run-up to the war. Was that your...
Well, certainly in the subsequent CSR programmes, we asked for significantly more money than we eventually received, yes.
And then in your discussion of the negotiations for the 2002-2003 budget, was the possibility of operations against Iraq a feature in those discussions?
I mean, the settlement was, I think, in July 2002. So certainly we were aware of the possibility, at any rate. But I think the answer from the Treasury would be that, in a sense, there was a separate urgent operational requirement process to supplement the overall budget once actual war fighting was imminent.
Yeah, we'll come on to that in a second. Was your feeling when you looked at your budget for 2002-2003 that this was still a budget under pressure?
Yes.
Now, generally speaking, the Ministry of Defence does not, as you've indicated, expect to fight wars on the defence budget. There are always going to be special costs of fuel, ammunition, replacement of equipment lost. So the idea is that these would come out of the Treasury Reserve?
That was always the understanding, yes.
And this is where the urgent operational requirements come in. But just again, because I think these can be quite complex issues, the degree to which you would need urgent operational requirements to some extent would reflect the size of the defence budget, because if you've been able to purchase sufficient stocks beforehand, you're less likely to need urgent operational requirements.
I mean, that must necessarily be right, yes. I mean, one of the urgent operational requirements for Iraq were desert combats and desert boots. I assume, I don't know, but I assume that in the first Gulf War, such clothing was kept in store, ready and available for operations in the desert. Desert combats were part of the URs, and I know some of the soldiers resented having to wear their green combats rather than their desert combats.
That's a particular issue I do want to come on to. I'm just trying to get the background sorted.
But if I could put the other side of the case,
yes.
But just for the sake of completeness, really, one of the problems with maintaining stores of equipment is that they necessarily deteriorate.
Yes.
So I accept that it's a judgment, but the judgment is how long you keep kit that you don't use, knowing that at some stage it will have to be replaced simply by passage of time. So the UOR process, whilst it obviously does or can cause difficulty in an urgent situation, nevertheless may be a sensible process in terms of avoiding the replacement of kit that's never actually been used.